All right. Rahul Rustogi is a Dastangoi storyteller and postdoctoral research associate in folklore at the University of UW-Madison. His work moves between oral narrative, embodied performing, and questions of historicity, with particular attention to the Qissah genre of North India and Pakistan. Drawing on the rhetorical and prosodic devices of classical Urdu dastans, he explores how these forms open pathways towards speculative thought that resists both modernistic and anthropocentric frames. The title of his talk is My Grandma the Idiot, an Informance on Charting Ante-modern Epistemologies through North Indian oral storytelling traditions. It's going to be delivered as both a performance and a talk. This presentation examines oral storytelling traditions of North India to map the landscape of traditional and contemporary narratives in India. The presentation identifies key elements that mark anti-modern narratives and positions these as windows to traditional and indigenous epistemologies. In addition, the Informance seeks to delineate narrational faultlines that emerge during India becoming a postcolonial entity. Rahul surveys and presents folk narratives from Pandavani, Dastangoi, Aalha, and Qissahs, as well as modern narratives such as short stories with an emphasis on their enabling of imaginations. Ultimately, the presentation helps to situate traditional storytelling as a valuable source of postcolonial scholarship, explore how its story worlds can inform decolonized speculative thought. Rahul, to you.
Thank you, Taimur. That was so well said and so well read. Yeah, I really look forward to the speaker. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Rahul, as Taimur said, and I'm going to do this, what we call informance. So I'm a folklorist, and one of the things that I want to do is create genres of scholarship that are also performative. So today's informance will include a little bit of performing and a lot of whatever the other thing is, or presentation or talk. Because this is a CSA talk, etymology of the word talk. The word talk comes from Middle English Tolkien, which basically means to tell a story. So talk is essentially a form of telling a story, which is what I seek to do for the next 45 minutes or so. How I'm going to do this is that I'm going to give you a very tiny introduction, go into a dramatic reading of a particular short story. Come out of that bit will be kind of like a performance. We'll come back to the talk segment of it, and then I'll go through a few points that I want to kind of put across. And during that, I'll keep switching between performing and so on and so forth. Because this is a talk, we will, as I think is clear to you by the confusion in my words, is that this performance will be more of like a liminal kind of space between where we move between performing and thinking and reflecting and receiving and scholarship and performance and voice and tone and all of that. So instead of looking at this as kind of an academic scholarship related thing, like straitjacketing is like it as that, I would urge all of you or invite all of us to rethink this mode of delivering a certain kind of scholarship in perhaps a new way. So that's what the lay of the land is, so to speak. So that's that. Also, I know that Sarah very kindly asked all of us to keep our questions till the last, and that's great. But if at any point of time you're lost or you're like, can you give me some clarification on that? Please raise your hand and just let me know. Because the worst thing for a performer and a folklorist in particular is when I'm talking to a folk and they're not getting what I'm trying to say. So that's the long and short of it. Let's get to it. So I want to talk about essentially I want to talk about the contrast that exists between stories that were told and understood and retold in India before the struggle of independence, if I may put it that way. I'm just like arbitrarily taking that as like a little bit of a marker of the pre and post. So the stories that were being told before that and the stories that came to be told after that. And there exists a very sharp disjuncture in that moment that India's storytelling embraced, or like a very different route that the storytelling took, or those traditions took pre and post independence. So what my aim is to kind of essay a little bit of what the pre-independence storytelling world or that landscape looked like, and then contrast it with some modern storytelling and so on and so forth. So to that end, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start with a little bit of a dramatic reading, which I hope hopefully it's not too dramatic, but I'm going to read or dastanify in front of you and actually a post-modern story, so not like a postmodern, but like post-colonial India story, which will hopefully I'll be able to get you to a particular kind of a sticking point or a pivot that the story has, a knot, if you may, that the story has, and we'll try to untangle the knot through the performance. This story is written by Bhishma Sahni, who was, if you know the lay of the land, Balraj Sahni, the legendary Indian actor. Bhishma Sahni was his younger brother. He's written some really, really interesting novels and works, particularly called Tamas, a novel called Tamas, which is about India's partition and the experience of migration during that. This particular story is called Chief Ki Dawat, which basically translates to the boss came to dinner. And this was published in 1954 in a journal called Naya Sansar, which means the New World. It's important to pay attention to the name of this journal because that'll come up later. So an English translation of this story was done by Lakshmi Holmstrom. She's from the University of Essex in 1972. And this story came to me in 1994 as a part of my academic curriculum when I was in the 9th grade. So that's the story of it and my relationship to the story. I'm not using the lectern because traditionally storytelling performances in India were always seated storytelling. You never stand and tell a story. You always sit down and tell a story. So that's why this. And let's go. Any folk story in India, all folk stories in India. And when I say India in this talk, when I say India, I actually mean the Urdu speaking territory of India and Pakistan. Like that's what I'm trying to refer to. I don't necessarily mean India as like the state boundary of India. I'm talking about the Urdu speaking world. So any story in India has to begin with an invocation. That's just like you don't start without that. So there'll be an invocation, and then I'll go into the story. तो करूं कैसे तौहीद यज़दां रकम झुका जिसके सजदे में अव्वल कलम तो अब सुनिए इस खामा की जुबानी ताज़ा किस्सा नई कहानी. For how can I start the story without bowing to the cause of all creation? And now, my friends, listen to this new story by this green storyteller. The story revolves around a family that has a family of two, a husband and wife. The husband is a really aspirational worker in a corporate firm. He's gotten his job after a lot of hard work, and he really wants to advance through the echelons and rise to the top. They live with an old woman who is the husband's mom, and she's pretty much like a ball and chain type of situation, because the husband cannot shun her out of the house because what will people say? But at the same time, he doesn't know how to include her in what goes on and so forth. So this is a story of one particular night, and I have written this dastan or this qissa from the point of view of a child that is in the household, who's pretty much like a fly on the wall and is seeing what's happening. My father works in this firm. He works late and gets home later in his iron car with big tires and even bigger wheel caps. He gets out and tells his driver exactly when to report for tomorrow's duty. It's a company car. Dad has been the employee of the year for 3 years in a row. Today, however, is a special day because the chief is coming for dinner. Dad is excited, and so is mom, and so is me. All fancies, all shinings, all glitterings have been bought already. Mom is looking through the house with a magnifying glass. All edges align, all lights shine, all is ready. Food, cushions, music, and wine. The chief, I have heard, will descend from America. Who hasn't thought of America with a yearning sigh? Dad whistles. His walk is more like a dance today. Like he has all his one-liners, his cigar collection, his Anglophone friends, all at the ready. Nothing can ruin this party of all parties that's going to go on tonight. But what of Dadi? Dadi is a word for grandma. But what of Dadi? Old hag doesn't know how to speak or gesture in English. Uncouth, sitting with her feet on the chair, sleeps. She sits with her feet on the chair, sleeps while she sits, and snores. That is right. He's certain and stern that Dadi won't come out to see the guests. She has been told, when us are in the drawing room, you sit near the dining area. When us are moving to the dining, you take the little door to the bathroom and sit in the drawing room. Don't you snore, feet on the floor. Mute is the word, as us people galore. And then it's time. The white boss comes in, the white chief comes in with his blonde wife. Curious eyes, alabaster bodies, humble shoulders. The chief met everyone, frolicked, shook hands, had his jokes, heard a lot of jokes, cracked a few, dropped incentives. Promotions were on the offing to those that exceed, excel, and extol. And promotions means visits to America, green cards, citizenships, cars, discos in the land of the never setting sun. Dad salivates a little. Onward To the dinner, sir. The best meats await. Dadi, near the dining area, sleeps on a dining chair. Feet on the chair, head lolling, snoring aloud. Oh, what catastrophe! Dad has got a red face, red eyes too. He wants to jolt up the old hag, but the chief leads the way. Namaste, Dadiji. How do you do? Now Dadi's got a pale face, pale lips too. Namaste, Saab, she says. She thinks, oh, he offers his hand, perhaps for a handshake. But how do I shake it? Which hand to use? How strong a grip? How many shakes? For how long? And so the Dadi starts to question herself over and over again as she gets more and more and more diffident in greeting the boss. The boss, however, is not interested in the handshake with the Dadi. He's more interested in the pulkari that the Dadi is wearing. Pulkari is something like this remotely, but much better embroidered in a very detailed embroidery form. So the chief asks the Dadi that this is great. Can you show me how to do it? Can you make a hanky out of it, a handkerchief with pulkari out of it? Dadi doesn't understand. The dad translates this, and Dadi says, my eyes are too weak. I am too frail. I have forgotten this work long before. I cannot do this. Can you buy a handkerchief with pulkari for the chief? But the dad senses that buying a handkerchief would mean not getting the promotion, because that will be unkind or unaccommodating of the chief's request. So he kind of coaxes his mom and says that, I'll get a big promotion if you actually manage this pulkari. And the Dadi says, oh, you will get a promotion with this pulkari. And he says, and the dad says yes. And Dadi says, okay, I'm going to do that for you. Dadi then sits up from her dining chair, goes into her attic, and pulls out her sewing supplies and embroidering supplies that have been cast aside for a couple of decades. And that's where the story ends. My question, when I read this story for the first time, when I was in, I think, high school, was this: why does the Dadi choose to do pulkari even though she knows she's getting nothing in return? Like, her situation with her family is not going to get better. Her own health is not going to get better. It's going to probably take a lot out of her. Her eyes are going to deteriorate further. So why is it that the Dadi chooses to act in this way? And in this, I think Bhishma Sahani puts his finger at a very interesting fault line, a fault line that differentiates traditional epistemology with a modern one. On what pretext does one act? Why does one do what one does? And if we are to take this, if we are to, in my opinion, if we are to take a journey into this pre-modern epistemological land, wherein the pretexts of actions and speaking and talking were very different from the modern ones, I think there's no better way than folk stories and traditional narratives that survives thousands of years till today, hopefully till today, and use that as our foray into that epistemology and that makeup. So for that reason, I'm going to. One second, I'm a little lost with my papers as is. Informance's curse. So for that reason, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to chart the history of one such narrative storytelling called Dastangoi, reached to a point where Dastangoi starts till the point where the Bhishma Sahani question comes as to why the Dadi becomes an idiot and does something that's completely not in her interest at all, and then expand on how this fault line shows up in different genres in different ways. So Dastangoi is a form of oral history telling or oral storytelling that came to India from Persia and Arabia back in 800 AD or 1000 AD. It comes to India in Farsi, but in India, it kind of embraces Urdu, it embraces Rekhta, it embraces Braj, it embraces Hindi, it embraces Sanskrit, and it embraces a couple of new story elements to it, and becomes a different form and comes into it's a really magnificent form around the centuries of 1500s and 1600s. It comes to Mughal courts, gets a lot of encouragement there, gets a lot of patronage from Nawabs and the Mughal emperors, as I said, particularly Akbar, who was a lovely patron for many art forms, including Dastangoi. He used to actually commission Dastangos to tell stories, and as Dastangos told those stories, he also commissioned artists to kind of draw what the Dastango was talking about. So in a sense, this was really like primordial cinema in its own way that Akbar was doing using Dastans and painting and Mughal painting style. So when we start talking about this and when we reach to these Mughal courts, what we see is that Dastangoi is patronized by a lot of Mughals and the Nawabs and so on and so forth, but very precipitously, during the struggle for independence, Dastangoi suffers a precipitous decline, and it's all but wiped out. Why? Because the Victorian sensibilities understand these folk stories, like Dastans and other Qissahs, to be juvenile, to be savage, to be products of an immoral, irrational, unsophisticated mind, to be obscene, to be voluptuous, to be unsuitable for the modern mind, and they found this college in Calcutta, and they commissioned all the storytellers there, where everyone starts telling these stories, and what they start doing there is that they start sterilizing those stories and producing more anglicized forms, not only which are not translations, but like they excise a lot of what they consider obscene and unfit from these stories, and start producing stories that are more amenable to the biblical worldview, pretty much. So that's what starts going on. But the more curious phenomena that starts going on at that point of time is that during the struggle for independence, the Indian intelligentsia, the Indian writers, Indian painters not so much, but the Indian writers, particularly those working under the umbrella of what is called the Progressive Writers Association, a bunch of writers that got together and said, we're going to create a new world. This is a new world. We're going to depart from all superstition and all of this and create new things, which is why, as I was saying earlier, when Bhishma Sahani publishes this story in Naya Sansar, the new world, that's what PWA's mandate is. And PWA is like, yeah, we're going to start writing. We're going to start writing stories that are Indian, but for the modern mind. But something really curious happens in that moment. PWA, or the modern short story writers and novel writers, they also leave traditional style of storytelling, the traditional genre of storytelling, the traditional stylistic devices, the literary components, all to fall by the wayside, and they start writing stories that are O. Henry stories in India or Charles Dickens novels in India, and so on and so forth. And that's a very curious moment for me because they choose to write about India, but those stories are not in the genre of the Mahabharata or any folk stories or the Ramayana and so on and so forth. So there exists this clear fault line before and after the recognition of an adaptation of modernity by even the Indian intelligentsia and Indian writers. So when they start writing about this, there's a clear disjuncture, and I, as a folklorist, am very curious about this disjuncture, about what is the difference between these things. So now let me go through a few characteristics of stories before and after the PWA movement, or before and after the colonial movement, to see how things shifted. So number one, I'm very interested in how, I'm very interested when I read stories, I'm very interested in how they relate to their environment. By environment, I mean to animals, to nature, to trees, and how is it that they position the human being within this larger universe that they seem to occupy. And this probably is one of the most interesting way that this fault line kind of shows up, because when we look at pre-modern narratives in India, folk narratives in India, Dastan narratives in India, epic narratives in India, we see that a lot of it is around animals. Not only are animals prominent characters like those in like Aesop's fables and things like that, but animals are prominent characters in like mainstream stories. So, for example, very famous story, very famous tale called Padmavat, in which Padmavati is Queen Padmavati is it's about Queen Padmavati's conquests that aim at capturing Queen Padmavati and so on and so forth. In that story, the whole thing is that Padmavati is actually seduced by a parrot. She really likes her parrot. And it is the parrot that, and her father blackmails Padmavati through this instrument that I'm going to kill your parrot if you don't do as I say. So Padmavati is not only fond of the parrot, she's kind of inseparably associated with her parrot, Harirama. In a different qissa, Mir Taqi Mir, who is hailed as the god of Urdu, all Urdu aesthetics and literature, writes a story about a peacock and how a queen falls in love with the peacock. So he writes. So the story is long, but I'm going to read a couple of verses that he writes about this thing, and he says, "Ishq ki hai ye saal, ishq hi ki hai ye taza kariyan, इश्क ने पर्दे में जाने मारियां, इश्क से क्या मीर कितनी गुफ्तगू, खाक उड़ा दी इश्क ने हर चार सू, तायरो ताऊस हैवां अजदहे, सब खपे क्या इश्क में कोई कहे." What Mir is saying is that it is love that makes the world go round. It is love that causes things to happen in a realistic way. And all the birds, the peacocks, the animals, the dragons, all of these are in love all the time. So Mir, and then later he says, तो ये इश्क की हंगामा आराई है, जिसका मतलब कि इंसान तो क्या, हैवान और चरिंद परिंद सब इश्क के सौदाई हैं. It means that love is not something that occupies the human domain. It's the human being that occupies love's domain, and love is all encompassing of all the metaphysics, all the plants and animals and the fauna and the flora and everything. But when we get to the post-colonial narratives, we see love, we see bonds, we see relationships, all as parts of the human domain. Not only a human domain, but also a very culturally specific domain. So in that sense, narratives after colonialism understand human environment interaction in a very specific and a very, very different way from how pre-modern narratives approach it. Hey Khagamrag, hey Madhukar Shreni, tum dekhi Sita Mraganayani. In the epic Ramayana, when Ram is looking for his wife, because he doesn't find any answers, he starts asking to the birds, to the animals, to the leaves. Did you see? Do you know where my wife is? And not coincidentally, Ram gets the news of his abducted wife from a bird that fought the demon that was abducting Sita, tells Ram of where he is. So in that sense, the relationship between man and ecology is very different in pre-colonial stories and post-colonial stories. Another thing that's very curious about the pre-colonial and post-colonial storytelling is that somehow when after colonialism, when writers started writing, they also dispensed with this idea that a story can be told and retold that is adapted in many variations. So Bhishma Sahani's story that I wrote, that I told you today, is the story. Ramayana is not the Ramayana. No Ramayana is the Ramayana. No Mahabharata is the Mahabharata. It's very curious as a folklorist and as a student of the post-colonial mind. I'm very interested in as to why does this happen, that writers start associating their names to stories, right? And the whole idea of there being a story that is a story structure that is amenable to variation, adaptation, and most importantly, to subversion, is absent in the postmodern writing. When people like Bhishma Sahani or Premchand or Ismat Choghtai, when they are composing their fiction, Rajendra Singh Bedi, all of them, when they are composing their fiction, all of them are, none of them is actually thinking that these stories are to be taken away and adapted by people. So when as a folklorist and a performer, I want to perform these stories, I get into a very strange tussle, because I'm like, can I make a variation here and there? Because that's where this style of storytelling is mute, where the earlier style of storytelling was just absolutely all over the place with that. So when Pandavani singers sing Mahabharata, they sing it from a very specific point of view. When Aalhas are sung, they are sung. It's not like, oh, that guy, that. So, like, for example, if you folks, if I may give a parallel in music, so like, say Ghalib wrote a ghazal, right? Ghalib wrote a poetry, a poem. When we listen to that poem being sung, we always understand that as a poem being sung by Jagjit Singh or by Ghulam Ali, or his version of this poem, her version of this poem, and that version of this poem. We never approach that. We never have that approach to like Bob Dylan's music or whoever it is, right? It's a different kind of system. These two, and that's very curious. I'm curious about what happened to bring that about. But nevertheless, these are interesting things. The third thing that I find really fascinating is that when critics start reading these stories, so when pre-modern critics read pre-modern stories, and when postmodern critics read postmodern stories, these critics also, the criticism also starts on very different angles and towards very different points, towards very different teleological ends, if I may. When critics read postmodern stories, the questions they ask is, what is morality here? How is the subaltern being reflected here? What is the role of caste here? What is economic class doing in this story? Are these characters speaking to the socio-political milieu in which they are immersed and they probably are evocative of? When pre-modern critics look at pre-modern stories, they ask a very different question. They ask, how are these stories, or what are these stories telling us of the human psychology? So pre-modern critics understand stories as windows to the human psyche. So they're trying to map what in these traditional narratives tells us about our own psyche. Postmodern criticism is, what do these stories tell us about the socio-cultural milieu in which this story is set? And that's why the questions that these folks ask, the sub-questions that these folks ask, are very different, and that's the disjuncture between Bhishma Sahni's in Bhishma Sahni's story, The Chief Came to Dinner, because one, as a reader of a postmodern story, cannot make sense as to how does this pre-modern epistemology sort of get here and what to do this, how exactly is that? And actually, as a matter of fact, I gravitated toward this story because when I was growing up as a kid in India, my grandma was exactly like that. She used to do a lot of things where I was left wondering as to why are you doing this? So, for example, she would constantly haggle with the domestic help that used to come to our home, and she used to say, "Oh, she's so problematic. This is so bad. She doesn't do her job well, and she sleeps on the job, and blah 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 blah." But she never fired her. She never fired. She'll loan out money to her. My daddy would loan out money to the domestic help. My daddy would help her in many different ways, but all the time keep telling all of us how bad the domestic help is. So my younger mind used to be confused as to, like, why do we not get rid of her, get rid of this domestic help if at all she's so problematic. But that's the knot that Bhishma Sahni is trying to entangle and having us untangle it. That there's something other than a modern rationalistic epistemology that exists in our makeup, and what to do about that. So that becomes a little bit of a evidence of this disjuncture between a purely rationalistic viewpoint or our outlook of the world versus a more non-rationalistic outlook to the world, at the world. Another thing that's a fourth thing that I find really fascinating about these stories is that when you ask yourselves, when we ask ourselves, okay, this question as to, like, okay, what is this character in this story, right? So in the story that I just told you about the chief and the husband and the dadi, when you listen to the story, what these characters mean to you is like, yeah, there's this family, and of course this is not real, but it is what Francesca Orsini calls a probabilistic fiction that can happen. Maybe it didn't happen, but it can happen. And the characters there are then, like, kind of placeholders of those sorts of identities and constellations of several of those identities fusing together. So in this particular story, the dad is a upwardly mobile English-speaking individual, aspirational, urban, gravitating towards advancement and all of that. So that character is a constellation of this. When we look at pre-modern stories, characters there are complex in their own way. Pre-modern stories, you don't know what the character is at the outset. So for example, there's a story that I wanted to read, but I think we are a little bit out of time, so I won't go there. But there's a character in this story, and this is a Jatak story out of the Buddhist Jataka, wherein there is a domestic help of a queen. And at a point in time, domestic help says, okay, I'm going to test the queen and see if she's actually as intelligent and as sagacious as everyone thinks her to be. This idea that a domestic help, or the subaltern, the one that's under the surface, plans to test the queen, is an unthinkable plot in modernistic storytelling, in the postmodern storytelling. So the characters that exist in pre-modern storytelling are many a times symbolic characters. They are symbolizing something. What they symbolize in a particular instant, in a particular instance, is a matter of more investigation and papers that you're going to read by me. So when we look at character work in postmodern stories, it revolves a lot around the new world, the Naya Sansar that Bhishma Sahani writes in, the socio-political milieu, the class exploitation, worker exploitation, independence, liberation, all of these themes. Whereas when you look at the pre-modern work, we're looking at symbolism as to asking questions like, what is this world? What is my place in this world? Who am I? So really like deep ontological and epistemological questions, as is reflected in this verse by Ghalib that I'm going to read and end my talk with. ये परी चेहरा लोग कैसे हैं, गमजाओ इश्को अदा क्या है, सब्ज़ो गुल कहाँ से आते हैं, अब्र क्या चीज है, हवा क्या है. So Ghalib asks in one go, for wherefore these fairy-faced angelic beauties descend on the earth. He's talking about beautiful women, and how do they learn these ways to charm, and ways of charming, and ways of beauty. And then he says, right, and in the next line he says, and by the way, what about this greenery and flowers in this earth? Where do they come from? And what about these clouds and these clouds and this air? Where on earth is all of this coming from? And Ghalib asks this question, a question that does not get asked in any postmodern criticism or creation. So that's kind of the lay of land that I wanted to kind of put forward through my talk, and hereby I'm done.